Okay, thank you. I am very grateful to Professor Benaggiano because he paved the way for this presentation, which is part of a presentation I will do a little bit later on the general picture of this great obstetrical syndrome. Let me first introduce the concept. The great obstetrical syndrome is a concept that I introduced with Roberto Romero a few years ago. Okay, there were two editorials in the journal which I directed, Journal Maternal Fetal Neonatal Medicine, looking at this concept. And this concept was, elaborating a previous other editorial from Roberto Romero in the same journal a few years before. What is the reason why we introduced this concept? The majority of disease in obstetrics are based on the clinical presentation of disease. They are not dealing at all with etiology because we don't know, for many of them, the real etiology, or this etiology is multifactorial. Therefore, the diagnosis simply describes the clinical manifestation of the disease, and of course, since the disease is multifactorial, this can be better represented by the word syndrome. The second concept is that the disease which affect pregnancy are not only affecting the fetus itself, but they have a longer, probably pre-gestational period of incubation, and Professor Benaggiano, with the data of EVO, have already shown that there is, let's say, an imprinting for some disease, okay? And this disease also may affect later on the life, not only of the child, but also of the adult, with a concept which had been brought by David Barker a few years ago. So the obstetrical disorders, which are responsible for high degree of maternal problems and also fetal neonatal problems, can be summarized in great obstetrical syndrome, in which the key factors are the multiple etiologies, the long preclinical stage, the frequent fetal neonatal involvement, the predisposition to a gene-environment interaction, many of them can be predicted even before pregnancy, and finally, the clinical manifestations are adaptive in nature, as I will show in a moment, particularly for preterm birth. Now we know that we have to switch our attitude to consider only the clinical manifestation and then to care for them to what is the etiology. Nobody in the area, for instance, infectious disease will tell you, okay, it's a fever, what we give to him. The fever is a clinical manifestation, but we know that there is an underlying a bacterial infection, a viral infection, something else. And then you can address the right therapy, or even the prevention. But if we don't switch from the clinical manifestation to something which is linked more to etiology, we'll never be able to prevent anything in obstetrics. And we know, as has been also underlined by the observation, which is mainly an anatomical pathology observation of Professor Brosers, but I enlighten many things, as I will show in a moment, that many of the major problems in pregnancy are not discrete entities, but they are syndrome. Let me go back a moment to the pregnancy and to understand why this problem arises from implantation and the key feature of placental bed formation. Implantation is a mechanism which is in which, as Fred Naftoling has underlined, is brought by an interaction of progesterone and other hormones in order to prepare the field for the embryo to be implanted in the uterus, okay? And we know that the progesterone concentration is crucial to avoid an inflammatory reaction which may prevent also implantation, okay? Now we know already that, for instance, some of the modification we have in the endometrium in the secretory phase, like, for instance, the expression in cyclin E, is crucial to understand if the progesterone can work optimizing implantation or not. Okay, so we know from the beginning also, even though the pregnancy is not even there implanted, which is something that has to do, you can see here that the outcome of pregnancy due to the expression of this cyclin E, for instance, is one of the markers of the endometrium, which in the luteal phase, which is then supported by micronized progesterone, can make a difference on the subsequent pregnancy success. But the major effect of progesterone is in titrating the immune tolerance of the mother, okay, to a genetically incompatible fetus, which is, of course, affecting and stressing the maternal immune system. And I think that we have to go a little bit earlier than progesterone, because nowadays it has been demonstrated there is a pre-implantation factor, PIF, which has been discovered by Eitan Barnea, an Israeli investigator now living in the United States, in which, as you can see, a very simple molecule produced by the embryo cells at the beginning and is been demonstrated to make this possibility that the fetus the embryo send signal to the mother that she has to adapt to the new situation. And you can see that if the PIF, this factor, PIF, is produced, then the reproductive process continue with implantation of the embryo. Otherwise, if it's not produced, there is no implantation at all. And we know that the embryogenesis and the PIF are linked to the fact that not only this factor is affecting the pregnancy toleration from the mother, but also the implantation itself, and is interacting with the progesterone. You see that all the reproduction, success, protection of embryo, development as a pregnancy biomarker or no, is given from this very simple 15 amino acid molecule, which is the very beginning of what we have in our embryo life. Then, of course, we have progesterone, which is affecting many of the reactions which are needed to have the embryonic cells to adapt to the maternal environment and interact with the deciduous cell. We have regulation of prostaglandin production, decreasing prostaglandin production. We have affection of VEGF receptor for angiogenesis, and we have several activities on enzymatic activities, which is facilitating immune tolerance. So we are a sort of allograft, which need to have an adaptive immunity, and this adaptive immunity is balancing between progesterone and a factor which is produced by the lymphocyte under the progesterone receptor activity, which is progesterone-induced blocking factor. And this blocking factor is balancing our Th1, Th2 activity, promoting mainly the Th2 activity, and blocking, for instance, the decidual network killer cell, and producing asymmetric antibodies which are not affecting and, let's say, fighting against the activity of the embryo we try to implant as better as possible. It has been demonstrated clearly that, if I have a blocking receptor antagonist like RU486, then my production of PIBF will be low and my pregnancy will end. Okay? As well, if I give a specific antibodies against IPIBF, my pregnancy will not continue and I will have a miscarriage. So it's crucial to understand this. And another problem is that the production of PIBF related to gestational weeks is linked to the continuum of pregnancy until to the end. If the production is low, in any case, pregnancy will end earlier, also preterm. The second point is placental bed formation. And is, I would pay all the tribute to Ivo to have found and to describe very well this very difficult mechanism. Which has been just described by Professor Benagiano, I go very fast about it, the spiral artery readaptation, let's say, and we also speak about that because this adaptation is a balance between angiogenic and antiogenic factors, again under the control of progesterone and many other substances which are related to complication of pregnancy. Again, we think that this is crucial to understand that this balance between angiogenic and angiogenic factors is crucial to understand why the spiral arteries may be remodeled. There is, of course, an interaction between the fetal and maternal compartment on this. The maternal compartment, we have heard, there is an imprinting that can be seen even before pregnancy, a predisposition to this, okay, on the junctional zone of the myometrium, and from the fetal compartment, of course, the balance between the vasculogenesis and angiogenesis. And this is something that give the right modeling of the spiral arteries. The paper which was mentioned also by Professor Benagiano is this pivotal paper published in a very unknown journal, the Biostatic and Gynecological Annual, in 72, in which already Ivo was predicting 4 steps of remodeling spiral arteries: decidual-associated remodeling, intraarterial trophoblast migration, intramural invasion, and remodeling with the destroy of the muscular mucosa, and re-endothelialization. All these mechanisms being depicted later by all the group of Brosens, Pinenborg, and so on. We have seen some of the paper produced and shown by Professor Benagiano. You see that this is something that you can easily now clearly understand. This, in a normal pregnancy, this destroy of the musculoelastic wall of the spiral arteries, and the substitution with a very large vessel, which make the difference. You can see normal preeclampsia has been shown. And this is at the junctional zone of the myometrium, particularly, and this is so important to understand. What are the consequences of this? Really, if in the normal pregnancy I have this invasion up to a certain point, but then is counteracted by the maternal immune system to stop at a certain point this interaction, then I will have, of course, a continuation of pregnancy up to the end. But if I have a smaller invasion of the spiral arteries, then there is a sort of mechanism which is making a fluctuation of oxygen and increasing the oxidative stress. And we believe the oxidative stress is the major key point to understand what is happening and being the pathway for many of the clinical manifestations of this. And this is why it's so dangerous, this situation. By the way, this situation takes weeks, takes between 9 to 18 weeks of our gestation. So the placental formation is not something that happens in a couple of days, but it's a very long procedure. And this long procedure can have effect, because it has been demonstrated, for instance, if I have an increased oxidative stress, which is independent from the karyotype of the consensus, then we have a spontaneous miscarriage. And this, schema will try you to understand that from implantation to a wrong placental beta formation and the rise of intraplacental oxygen tension, we may have oxidative stress, which can be balanced. It is a moment in which we can react in a proper way with a maternal diet, with an appropriate behavior, or we may increase with metabolic disorder, drugs, smoking, alcohol, and environment. So the two things can have different clinical manifestation according also to the behavior of mother, and then bring either to the possible resolution a normal placental function, or what we call more generally placental insufficiency, which is when the placenta bed has not been formed properly, and we have insufficiency, and then we have demonstrated that the oxidative stress, particularly important. By the way, the total antioxidant capacity, so our capacity to face the oxidative stress, decrease in pregnancy, okay? And, of course, in the preterm labor, like in gestational diabetes, there is higher antioxidant capacity, antioxidant capacity, and lower thiolic capacity, which is another marker, and more pro-oxidant capacity in the blood of the mother. So this is in keeping with this hypothesis. Now, the pathology of placental bed has been related, as Professor Benagiano said, to many of the big problems in pregnancy, either preeclampsia, more for gestational age, or growth retarded baby. It's very difficult to differentiate between the two, abruption placenta, fetal death. And why there are some different clinical picture? Interaction with the maternal body and with the characteristic of the mother. She is smokers, she is have a genetic predisposition, and so on. These make the difference between a placental insufficiency per se, a placental insufficiency with the growth restriction, or a abruption placental, and so on. Now, the pathogenesis of preterm birth can be seen in this scenario. We know that there is a genetic predisposition. There is a reproductive system disease which predisposes to preterm birth. We know before a woman can be pregnant if she's able to carry the pregnancy up to the end. We know in many cases, okay? It's difficult, but we know there are maternal disorders, the age of a woman, ethnicity, and so on. We know that there are characteristics which don't bring the pregnancy up to the end in many women. Okay? And then, okay, during pregnancy we have more maybe cervical risk of cervical insufficiency or uterine overdistension, like in the case of twins, or uteroplacental ischemia, inflammation, infection, and so on, which bring, of course, to the activation of labor prematurely. Now, for instance, in reproductive system disease, we know nowadays that polycystic ovary syndrome is associated with inflammation and is bringing more preterm birth. As well, endometriosis is linked with immune regulation, which affect probably the immune competencies to tolerate the embryo, and we have more, placental insufficiency, growth restriction, and preterm birth. So the preterm parturition syndrome can be defined as well because there are multiple etiologies, there is a fetal involvement, okay? The gene environmental interaction nowadays, we know there are some genes which predispose the woman to have a short pregnancy, and it's adaptive nature, just think infection. When the mother gets an infection like the chorioamnionitis, the only things nature can do is to expel the fetus and the uterine content, otherwise the mother will die. And nature, we privilege the mother because we can do a fetus afterwards, but we can replicate the mother. And for maintaining our, generation, we have to have women to continue. I say that it's very difficult to classify preterm birth and then to understand how are the possibilities to prevent. This is a very recent study which has been produced between FIGO and March of Dimes, that is the major foundation in the United States dealing with the preterm birth. We, in a specific study group which has been set up by FIGO, we look to recruit many data from countries, 4.2 million pregnancies practically, in which we have been able to have a lot of risk factors to look at. And you can see that this was starting from previous study in which many of the studies which have been done in the period of preterm birth were looking to different factors, but even though they are going from 10,000 women to 500,000 women, they were not, homogeneous in looking to specific risk factors. This specific study was the largest by far, has been published a few minutes ago, and you can see that these factors, which are pertaining to data coming from country in which there is a database of pregnancy up to the, controlling many factors, you see that the majority of risk factors which are important for preterm birth are, of course, the prior preterm birth, which is consistent everywhere, preeclampsia, diabetes, and so on, but some factors which are very less, let's say, incidence as risk, but they are much more frequent in the population. And also the male sex and the previous cesarean section are risk factors, which are interesting because have been confirmed by our initial observation of more than 10 years ago. You see that, in fact, in the analysis that we did of Italian risk factors a few years ago, previous cesarean section was for the first time found to be a risk factor of subsequent spontaneous preterm birth. So we have to be very careful of these epidemics of cesarean section, because if it's done in a very, let's say, mature lady, because it's only one baby after an IVF cycle and so on, okay, because there will probably no reproduction afterwards. But if it's done in a 20 years old young woman, when you have to think that that woman can reproduce again, and that we increase the risk to have a more, risk of preterm birth. So the new risk factors which have been introduced are the previous PTB. Of course, the assisted reproductive technologies are increasing, even in singletons, the risk of preterm birth, cesarean delivery, non-communicable disease infection, and the prediction, we heard from Professor Eville, soon we are various, but we may predict also before pregnancy, and prevention now is a bench of course, substances and attitudes that unfortunately cannot be adapted to every situation, because in a syndrome we have to be multifaceted, and probably also the prevention can be different. So in conclusion, I would like to stress that nowadays we may link, implantation to the placenta beta formation, which has been described so well by the study of Ivo Brosens, looking at the balance between angiogenic and antigenic factors, and having the oxidative stress as probably the messengers of all the clinical manifestation. Clinical manifestation which depends from the phenotypically by the interaction with the mother. So we may have a partial, let's say, alteration of implantation and placental beta formation, then we can get preterm labor, intrauterine growth restriction without hypertension. But if I have a complete, atherosis of these vessels, as has been shown, I have a preeclampsia, HELP syndrome, or if I have obstructive lesion, I have a recurrent miscarriage, abruption placenta, and stillbirth. You see that these are modulation, that we have phenotypes which are coming from the same base. Is the interaction with the maternal bed, but we make a difference. I would like to say specifically, looking to preterm birth, that in the recent report, we have found factors which have a high individual risk, but low population prevalence, like prior PTB, hypertension, diabetes, or low individual risk, like maternal age, fetal male sex, and so on, but have a higher population prevalence. If I put all together in picture, what is important for prevention of preterm birth? Unfortunately, let's say, 2/3, we don't know yet, because why fetal male sex is altering the length of pregnancy, we don't know really, okay? And probably we know poverty, but poverty per se is very unclear. So in any case, the effect to intervention are to alter the clinical practice, for instance, introducing progesterone or aspirin in different cases, or in changing the public health system, for instance, promoting a better diet, nutrition, and so on. They probably still act on the preterm birth intervention only in 1/3 of cases. We can do prevention of 1/3 of cases. We need a lot of research going on, and of course, further we'll discuss. In the next meeting we will have in a month in London, we launch the first World Congress Maternal Fetal Neonatal Medicine. Everybody of you is invited. We'll continue to discuss this story because it's fascinating. Try to change, the view of the obstetric pathologies from the clinical manifestation to a more etiological sound terminology. Thank you very much.